Welcome, everyone. Just want to let you know you're in the right place with Operation Parent. And we're so thankful that you're joining us for our webinar with Dr. Crystal Coir today. So thanks so much for taking some time out of your day today. We know that your time is super valuable and that you would choose to spend it with us in the middle of the day is a real honor. Just to let you know you're in the right place with the webinar with Dr. Crystal Coir and Operation Parent. I'm going to take you through a couple of our technical features here in just a little bit as we get more folks in the webinar. If you're a long-time attendee of our webinars, it's a great time to go ahead and register for our upcoming webinar. I know many of you know Dr. Aaron Weiner and his work already, but he's coming back to join us for another webinar on August the 2nd. And we're going to be talking about what every parent should know about emotional trauma. So go ahead and take a couple minutes and register for that next webinar. It's up right in the middle of the web page at operationparent.org. Also want to let you know this registration is not live yet, but it will be very soon. We're working with Dr. Erin Tirada, who many of you have met on her recent webinar, met her. She's going to talk with us about eating disorders, and that webinar is going to be on October the 4th at the usual 1 p.m. Our mission at Operation Parent is to love and support parents by providing real-world information, connection, and most importantly, hope. I'd like to talk with you about a couple of the technical ways you can participate in the webinar. If you can look up at the orange arrow on the top of your screen, if you want to click on that and open it all the way up, you can see the features that we're going to use today. We're mostly going to use the question feature. That's about halfway down. You're going to send questions and comments via that question section. Just so you know, we're going to work really hard to answer all the questions at the end of this presentation. We are expecting a lot of questions today with a large audience. You will be on mute during the presentation, but we will respond to any comments that you have in the question section. I want to let you know the handout is up here in GoToWebinar. You can just click on that handout to begin the download process. The handouts are going to be available there while we're in session. Once the webinar has ended, you will be able to download it. You will not be able to download it from here, but you should have received it in your email just prior to this webinar at the email address that you registered. We are recording this presentation and the recording will be sent 24 hours after the completion of this webinar. For our attendees of the lab webinar, a certificate of attendance will also be attached to your follow-up email. That's going to come in about 24 hours after the webinar. Please give us a little bit of time to process, and then we'll get both of those things to you after we close out the webinar today. There's going to be a short survey sent to you immediately following the program today. If you could just take 2 minutes to complete that, as many of you have done in the past and been very generous and gracious with your comments and feedback, please keep that coming. We do utilize that fully and every time, so continue to support us and encourage us by giving us constructive feedback and what you're hoping to see in the future with this webinar program. We've built a really vibrant community here, and we're looking forward to continuing to do that with your input. Now it's my distinct pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Crystal Coir. She's a therapist, a prevention researcher, a deep researcher, evidence-based researcher, and educator. She has written a phenomenal book, the NeuroWhereAbouts Guide, which we're going to teach you some snippets of that today. And she is amazing. She's dynamic. You're going to really enjoy your time with her today. We're so thankful for Sherry Phillips out of Texas, who made the introduction between Dr. Coir and us here at Operation Parent. And we can't wait to see what you're going to teach us today.
Wonderful. Oh, thanks for that invitation or that introduction. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, Michelle, and I feel honored to be a part of Operation Parent. Thank you so much. All right, let me share my
You bet.
screen here.
All right, we'll be here if you need anything during the presentation.
All right. Okay, everybody can see that screen and hear me. We're all ready to go?
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. All right, let me move this over a little bit so I can see. So welcome all of you guys who are here. I appreciate you choosing to do this today. I have a lot to share with you. I wrote this wonderful book, The NeuroWhereAbouts Guide. It took about 4 years. Really, it's about 15 years of research that I have been compiling and reading, and to give it to you in these two forms has been an honor for me. I received a fellowship from the Hope and Healing Center and Institute that helped me write it and get it translated into Spanish. It's been written in infographic style because I want people to have fun reading it, but I also read it out loud on Amazon and on Audible, so you'll be able to hear me. But I warn you, it's about a 400-page book, so it's about 14 hours of me talking. But it's not designed to be read in one sitting. It's designed really to be used as your kids grow and develop. And so I'm going to share with you guys today a brief synopsis of what's in it and what are some of the tools that you guys can use from it. So we're going to be talking about the brain. We're going to be talking about how the brain gets trapped by risky behavior. And then we'll spend the second half talking about what you can do to prevent and treat it. So I always like to start with this particular slide. These are pictures of me when I was growing up. And I always think about, you know, when therapists say, think of your inner child. I think of this picture here on the left of me when I was a real blonde, and I was about 5 years old, and life was pretty good and happy, and we stopped on the side of the road to take pictures. And then this second picture there, I'm about 11, 12 years old. It was the year my parents got a divorce. And unfortunately, it's also the year that we moved and started moving every year thereafter. And I had a young kid who said, oh, take summer school classes with me. We'll meet a bunch of people. And I met a bunch of people who were making the bad decisions that got them into summer school. And then I also went to my first party and took my first drink of alcohol. By the time this second picture was taken of me, when I was about 16 years old, I had already tried a lot of other substances, and another person said to me, let's teach you how to use in a needle. So between the ages of 16 and 18, I started using substances intravenously. I graduated a year early from high school. I was a straight A kid. I took all these summer school classes. And so I went really straight through, moved out, got my own apartment, and got into college and graduated to bigger and better, riskier behavior. By the time this last picture was taken of me, I was 18 years old with this big Texas hair. I have on a t-shirt that says drug-free body, and I just graduated from rehab. By the grace of God, I survived an overdose. And when I got into recovery and got back to school, I started studying everything I could about the brain in order to answer the question, why did this cute, smart, great kid make all these terribly bad decisions? So I want to share with you guys today what I learned in hopes that you will be able to use this information to prevent and treat issues in your lives, in your clients' lives going forward. Now today, a lot of my clients, parents, asked me, is it really that bad? I mean, I smoked in college, I'm fine. I started drinking in high school, I'm okay. The way that I answer this question is that 90% of adults who grow up and get diagnosed with a substance use disorder began engaging in that behavior when they were teens. And then when I really did a deep dive for the book, I found this particular study that's been replicated. And what we see is that the younger you are when you use any substance, the greater your risk of growing up and getting diagnosed with a substance use issue. So a lot of times you'll hear parents say, well, I want them to, use just at home, or I don't want to delay it because then they'll think it's a forbidden fruit and they'll go crazy in college. What I can tell you is that we're all going to kind of go a little crazy in college anyway, but the longer kids delay, look what happens. If you wait until you're 21 years old, you actually almost eliminate your risk of substance use issues. This is almost a perfect slope down that really transpires over a very important period of brain development time. And when I kept looking into this issue, I found a couple of studies, actually 3 studies that I put together in this chart that represent the onset range of mental health issues. And you can see that all these major mental health issues, the onset is either in elementary, middle, or high school. So this really led me to wonder, what is going on during this time? The adolescent and child brain is so fragile that if a kiddo starts engaging in a high-risk behavior or starts to have these symptoms, it changes the trajectory of their actual brain development. So let's talk about that. Here's what I learned about our beautiful brain is that it grows in 2 phases. The first phase is from birth to up to about puberty, around age 11, 12, when we grow 200 billion neurons. And then we hit puberty. And that kicks in the second phase of brain development when we actually lose 50% of those neurons. We end up with 100 billion neurons left over. But we are making room for a couple of things that the brain actually needs to clear out wiring for. Let me show you what those things are. This is actually an infant neuron. You've got the cell body, the long axon, and then this axon is covered by a fatty tissue called myelin. And these connectors, they look like tree roots and tree branches. Those are called dendrites. As this infant neuron grows and develops up to the age of 2, you can see the myelin is thickening and the dendrites are growing. Myelin, as it thickens, it allows our processing speed to shoot up because it is a substance that helps the electrical activity move down the cell. Dendrites are literally the hardware of learning. The more dendrites you have, the more skills you're going to have. And if you can see here at just age 2, you can see these skills that are growing and connecting. Now, our brain needs room for this. And so it actually starts to prune away cells at about puberty so that this thickening and connecting can take place. Here's what it looks like from the outside. Now, all of this growth is primarily taking place in our prefrontal cortex, or our frontal lobe, which sits right behind the forehead, about halfway up the skull. And you can see, according to this study that was published back in '99, as kids grow, you can see that the frontal lobe starts to thicken. Now, the darker color here, the more connectors we have, the less gray matter. So gray matter are literally the cells. We're starting to prune those away and make room for more white matter, the cells that are, the connectors that connect the cells. By the time we're 8, you can see it's really starting to thicken. But then we hit that second phase of brain development, about 12. And what you'll notice is that we've got a lot of other areas that are really connecting together. By the time we're about 11, 12 years old, we've got about 10 to 15% of our prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe. So remember, that's the adult brain that doesn't fully mature until we're 25. By the time we're 16, we've got about 45% of what our adult brain will be. Now think about that. We give them a license to drive at about 16 with 45% of their adult brain, with half a brain. Yep, we're going to probably have high insurance costs and a lot of poor judgment and potentially a lot of accidents, unfortunately. But this one was the most amazing one to me because by the age of 20, we have 80% of our adult brain online. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I thought I was grown by the time I was 17. And then to see that we actually have a whole fifth of brain development to go between the ages of 20 and 25 is amazing to me. There's so much of connecting and learning that's still taking place up to that age. Now, the brain has a rule that every parent, clinician, anybody who works with a kid should know. That rule is the use it or lose it rule. And that rule stays with us for the rest of our lives. As you guys probably have heard, the more you use your brain, the more it stays fresh and connects, and the less likely you are to have problems with memory or dementia, things like that. But when our brain is growing as a young person, this is an incredibly important rule because use it or lose it is what determines which skills you get really good at. Now, it's pretty obvious when you think about like academic skills. If you really love math, you're going to grow long strings of networked connections for that. If you don't like math, you're going to have shorter strings. But that's not what I'm talking about with the frontal lobe. The frontal lobe does executive functioning skills. If you look at that part of the brain, that is literally the CEO of your entire brain and body. It's the part of the brain that does all these very basic skills that allow you to live and flourish as a fully self-supporting adult. And they grow in 2 scaffolding layers according to those 2 growth phases of the brain. And so this chart really shows you what this looks like. And I've got this in a couple different places in the book too. So in elementary, well, from birth all the way through elementary up to middle, you've got what scientists call lower level executive functioning skills. These are the basic skills that you need to kind of, wake you up in the morning, remember your lunch, get to school on time, make sure you figure out the most important thing to do. Then you hit puberty, the brain moves into phase 2, then you start growing higher level executive functioning skills. These are the ones that'll get you up and out of your parents' house, becoming a fully self-supporting adult. And these are really critical for judgment, impulse control, regulating emotions, making good decisions. As a matter of fact, the #1 predictor of adult success is in this right-hand column. I wonder if anybody can guess which one that is. It's number 2, impulse control. The #1 predictor of adult success, which makes sense, is how well you're able to control yourself. Now, there's another one here that's really, really critical, and this one, of course, is abstract conceptual understanding. As we move from being very black and white, all or nothing, concrete thinkers, we move into the gray area, where we can have the ability to think in hypothetical terms, what ifs. That gives rise to another important executive functioning skill right there at the bottom, the ability to feel empathy. And this is why one of the high-risk behaviors I studied for my book, bullying, actually peaks in the 7th grade, because it's really the 7th grade where we switch from lower to higher level executive functioning skills. Those start coming online. We start to feel empathy like we didn't before when we were very concrete thinkers. Okay, you guys can see, because of the importance of this list, how critical these skills are. But remember, they're based upon the brain's rule, use it or lose it. And this is why I thought, oh my gosh, we have to create brain-based parenting techniques. So what I did is I put together in the book lots of different scripts so that you would learn how to talk to your kids about these skills. And the #1 thing you can do is praise them when you see them. So for the book, I studied a lot of different types of praise, and I learned that when you do primarily performance-based praise, attaboy, good girl, nice work, good job, It's not necessarily bad, but it can increase performance anxiety if that's all you use. Now, there's another kind of praise, intelligence-based praise. And when you say, oh, you're so smart, that'll be no problem for you. You're so intelligent and natural at this. Here's the negative. If that's all you use, when kids who are very smart hit a wall and something becomes difficult for them, they may attribute their failure to actually not being so smart. So what I'd love for you guys to do as parents and clinicians is use a little bit of IQ-based praise, a little bit of performance-based praise, and a lot of brain-based praise. So what that sounds like is, oh, I like how you solved that problem. Tell me how you did it. Ooh, good decision. What were you thinking? You know what? You took out the trash and I didn't even have to ask you. Thank you. Wow, I love how you switched from thinking about this to thinking about that. Like, you're really flexible in your thinking. It's really critical that we use brain-based praise to help increase those dendrites to make long strings of neuronal networks for these skills in the brain. Now, as a therapist, I work with a lot of parents. I do a lot of parent coaching and I see a lot of kids. And one of the biggest mistakes that I see parents make is they over-function for their kids. And so what I always like to say is, if you do all the problem solving and decision making for your children, they're not going to have long strings of neurons for problem solving and decision making, two really important higher level executive functioning skills, but they will have long strings of neurons for dependency on you to do their problem solving and decision making for you. Okay, so I paused here on this slide because it's so very important. And we just really finished the first quarter of our presentation and talking about the brain. So if you have any questions about the brain, pause here and write down your question. We'll get to in a second. But now I want to switch over to answer this particular question. How do alcohol and drugs and other high-risk behaviors affect the brain during this really important pruning process? Now, in order to answer this question, it's critical that we talk a little bit about another part of the brain located deep inside all of those wonderful lobes, called the limbic system. Most people know that this is the fight or flight part of the brain. My favorite picture of it is this 3D image. It's all these little teeny tiny organelles that are connected together. A very old part of the brain, older than the frontal lobe. And a lot of people don't know that it's also where all pleasurable experiences begin and end. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. And of course, in order to do that, we have to mention dopamine, the neurotransmitter that governs reward. Now, there are a lot of different neurotransmitters that are connected to increases of decreases in dopamine, like GABA and serotonin, norepinephrine, COMT, all of these. But dopamine's primary job is to let you know when there's something good for you in your environment, or when you need to go find something that's good for your survival. So it signals salience. And when you've done something that is salient or good for you, it gives you a feeling of calmness and happiness. It's like your reward for taking good care of yourself. I put this picture in here because I just think it must look exactly like fairy dust. I think so. So let's talk a little bit about how this works. One of the best ways to describe it is to describe what it's like when we don't have a lot of it in our system. So I want you to imagine that you forgot breakfast this morning and were not able to eat lunch, and what you might feel like when it's 4, 5, 6 o'clock and you have not eaten all day long. You probably feel pretty hangry. What's happening is that your limbic system is depleting itself of dopamine. And so your limbic system is saying to you, you need to go do something good for my survival. And until you do, I'm going to make you feel really uncomfortable. And then as soon as you eat, you get an increase of dopamine by 100%. Your limbic system says, Oh, Crystal, good job keeping me alive for the next 4 or 5 hours. We'll do it all again soon. Here's your reward. Feel calm and happy. Now, another behavior that humans do that's really good for our survival and good for our species survival is sexual activity. We get an increase of dopamine by about 150%. Now, these are normal, natural things that we do that are good for survival. Smiling increases dopamine levels. Eye contact increases dopamine levels, which no wonder we've all felt a little depressed over the last couple of years of having to mask up and be on Zoom, right? We are deprived of normal, natural dopamine spiking activities. But there are other things, behaviors, and substances that can spike dopamine levels too high. Like, for instance, snorting a line of cocaine gets you about a 350% increase in dopamine. Methamphetamine, 1100% increase. Heroin is about 1300% increase. I couldn't even put it on this chart because if you have a dopamine increase of that high, you won't even see food or sex anymore, which is kind of like what happens when someone gets addicted to opioids or heroin. One of the things they stop doing is eating, having healthy relationships with people. Now, here's what happens. Your brain has something called a hedonic threshold. Hedonic is the word for pleasure, and here it is. Most people spike their dopamine up and down all day long within this normal threshold, which means your brain can express about a 200% increase in dopamine at any given moment. Now, the danger is when we go above this threshold, two structural things happen to your brain. Now, let me show you a video that describes it. If we travel deep inside the limbic system and take a look at the part of the brain that actually increases dopamine. Here's a neuron. The dopamine is coming across the synapse, binding to those little receptor sites, and then, of course, on and on and on and on as the signal travels down the cell. But too much dopamine decreases the amount that's in the cell. And then you can't produce the same amount of dopamine that you did before. Now, if you've actually ever had a hangover, you know how that feels. Unfortunately, the next day, after all that dopamine increase last night, alcohol increases dopamine by about 250, 270, 300, depending upon the proof. You have this huge increase, and then the next day your cells are depleted of dopamine and it doesn't feel very good. But after about a day, 2, 3, you start to replenish that supply and feel normal again. However, here's what happens. The second structural change that happens in the brain, when you flood all those synapses with so much dopamine, this is a long dendrite and those little receptor sites at the end. When you flood the synapses, what you see is that your brain learns. It grows more dendrites, grows more receptor sites for dopamine. And so if you think about, if you go out drinking and you have way too much to drink, you may grow 1 or 2 more of these. But then the next time you go out, you may need to drink a little bit more because now you have more receptor sites for dopamine, and that's to get the same effect. That's what we call a tolerance building. But then after quite a few years of doing that, you have all these new receptor sites for dopamine. And now there's one day when you have one too many of these. And all the dopamine leaves your system and you have all of this new structure in there that's screaming out for dopamine. That's new brain structure. You can't unmake that. Now, the first structural change you can heal from, but the second one you really can't. New structure. And so once an addict, unfortunately, always an addict because of that structure. So what we want to do is protect our kids' brains so that they can definitely only spike dopamine levels within this natural threshold. If they spike it sooner, then now they're going to have a new set point that their brain is going to want to chase after. So I always give the example of myself in this scenario because I haven't used substances since February 3rd, 1989. So I have been in recovery a long time. But all I have to do is think about cocaine, especially if it's in a needle, and my mouth starts to water. I can almost feel those receptor sites that have been inactive for years kind of waking up and saying, ooh, she's thinking about cocaine. Is there cocaine? Where's the cocaine? What's going on? And so it's really important to remember that it can take a very short period of time to make all that new structure if it's something like meth or heroin, but it might take decades if it's something like alcohol or maybe even marijuana. The marijuana of today is so much more potent than it used to be, but it still spikes dopamine levels around 275, maybe up to 350. We're not really quite sure because we haven't studied it that much yet. So it could take potentially years or decades to become addicted to those substances, depending upon how much and how often. Now, if you have the genetics, there's a little bit different story. Your threshold may be lower because of something called reward deficiency syndrome. Now, here's how I learned it. The human body has about 30,000 genes in all of our DNA. Those genes tell our body how to react. I have a gene that says I'm going to have green eyes. I have a gene that tells my brain how much dopamine to make. But unfortunately, because I have addiction in my family, I've got up to potentially 2,200 of those genes that have been passed down that are linked to addiction and mental health. And actually, I know I've got about 1,000 of those. My brain does not make the same amount of dopamine that other people do. And that's been coined reward deficiency syndrome. That means I can only express up to this red dotted line. Now, what that means is if I go above that line, that's when my structural changes occur. But if somebody who's drinking the same amount as me, but they have a normal hedonic threshold, they will never spike to that level and potentially never become addicted to it. So you guys, I love this chart because it shows you that anybody can become addicted to anything if they spike their dopamine levels too high. But it also shows you how people who have a genetic predisposition make those structural changes sooner than other people. All right, now let's take a look at what it looks like from the outside in. This is a Fmri looking from the top down. And what you see here is the top 3 slides are somebody who has not used substances at all. And you can see all the lobes are on. The darker the color, the more activity. Frontal lobes are right here. The person on the bottom has just ingested cocaine, and what you notice, the frontal lobe shuts off. The limbic system stays lit, but the frontal lobe shuts off. And here's what's really interesting. This happens for pleasure, but it also happens for fear. If you're really, really, really scared, your limbic system kicks on and it shuts off your frontal lobe because you don't need to do complex thinking. In pleasure, if your limbic system is high on dopamine, it shuts off the frontal lobe because it doesn't need you to do complex thinking. It thinks that you've just done everything for survival. That's really scary because what if you're in between the ages of birth and 25? If you are of that age and you're doing this to your brain, it doesn't get to grow. And that is something we call arrested development. And so if somebody starts using here at about age 12 and they keep using all the way up until about here at age 20, their frontal lobe is not going to look like that one. It may look more like this one in the middle at about 16 or maybe 12 or 13, depending upon how frequently they used and when they began. Now, the scary part here is what if this 20-year-old does not stop? What if they keep going up to 25? Well, what you're going to see is a 25-year-old whose frontal lobe executive functioning skills are really still arrested and functioning at between 12 and a 16-year-old's brain. Now, that doesn't mean they aren't smart and can't learn. But think about executive functioning skills. Executive functioning skills are really your maturity, your ability to cope in the world. You probably know a lot of people who used a lot during their teens, maybe have a problem now. They might be smart and well functioning at work, but their ability to function relationally in life or to make good choices may be hampered. So this is what we all want to do, is delay use to make sure that that kiddo stays as sober as they can possibly be for as much control as we have, so that their brain fully develops so that they make better decisions when they do get into adulthood. So if this 20-year-old stops, just like me, I was 18 when I stopped, I actually had 7 years of brain development that I could catch up with, which is the good news. Our brain is so plastic during this time, meaning it's so flexible, is that if we can arrest the use of, we can stop the use of high-risk behavior, engagement high-risk behavior, we can actually keep arrested development from happening. Unarrest can occur and we can potentially catch up. Okay, so this is what it looks like when you're healing. This is the particular person I showed you earlier who was using cocaine, but this is him 10 days sober. His frontal lobe is still really off. Here the person is at 100 days sober. You can see the frontal lobe is starting to turn back on. But it takes about 18 months for this person returning to normal levels of functioning. And so this gives us really good scientific justification for actually making sure that our kids stay off of substances or get help as soon as they can. All right. I want to show you a few slides from different behaviors. This is alcohol. You can see our non-drinker has a lot more electrical activity when he's doing a memory test than our heavy drinker. You can see that the development of the brain is really going well for our non-drinker, but it's not here. Those long strings of neurons, when they grow long, they kind of squash into the brain and make those funky grooves. You can see the grooves and wrinkles, but not for our heavy drinker. Marijuana, on a SPECT scan, you should see a nice smooth surface if all your brain cells are connected. Looking from the bottom up, this really beautiful Amen Clinic scan shows a 16 and 18-year-old who have a history of marijuana use. And it's not holes in the brain, you guys, I promise. These are just areas that didn't grow and connect yet because of arrested development. If you take a look at sugar, looking from the back of the brain of somebody who has no eating disorder after eating sugar, lights up the brain. But then what you see in somebody who has sugar addiction after eating sugar, her brain really, here's the limbic system on both sides, lit up. She's got way too many receptor sites in her brain for dopamine, and now it's completely lighting up when she ingests sugar. You take a look at technology overuse. If you were to connect all the red dots, you'd see the brain connectivity of healthy adolescents who only use technology for minutes or a couple hours a day. The purple or the pink lines indicate the brain connectivity of a group of adolescents who dropped out of high school and spend 12 or more hours a day in the internet cafe. Now, this is a really amazing example of the use it or lose it, because look at how all these dense connections on top of the brain here, or right here on the side view, that's the sensory and motor cortex. They're using that part of the brain a ton, so they're growing lots of dense connections, but not in their frontal lobe. Like there should be all these red dots, lots of connections there, but they're just not growing those because they're not using that part of the brain. Use it or lose it. If you look at pornography addiction, here is a group of healthy subjects, and this is their nucleus accumbens right there. It's lit up to show you the size of it. Compulsive pornography users have doubled to triple the size because of all those neuronal connections that have grown more receptor sites for dopamine in the sensation-seeking part of the brain, right there. It really hardwires and changes the trajectory of brain. Now, this is a really interesting study that shows a control group who didn't play any video games compared to a group of men who played a very violent first-person shooter game for 2 hours a day. Now, it's interesting because they had them do this empathy test while in a fMRI, and you can see all the brain activity in the frontal lobe because remember empathy, frontal lobe skill. And then you see 1 week in, 2 weeks in, there's still a lot of activity in our control subjects, but not so much for our experimental subjects. And when you ask them, dude, what's going on? They say, man, I'm in this shooter game. I can't have empathy. That's a scary thought because they're only playing it for 2 hours a day, but they're shutting off their empathy, and that generalizes to real life. If they keep doing that all the way up until the age of 25, their empathy's not going to grow. The good news is when these guys got off the game, they took another scan 2 weeks later and said to these guys, do not play anymore, and the brain scans returned to normal. But that's a good testament to use it or lose it. Mental health does the same thing. Here it shows you a brain scan of somebody who's having a panic attack, and you can see the frontal lobe is really green, which means it's not as active as the red, which is, here's our limbic system right here, the amygdala, white hot from the top. If you look at depression, this is what a healthy brain should look like in this kind of scan from the side. Somebody who has chronic depression, their frontal lobe is just really off. Looking from the top, though, you can see that when this person gets help, medication plus therapy is what this person did, and you can see their frontal lobe, including their entire brain, is really turning back on. Okay, so let's move into solution. All right, you guys, what can we do? We know that executive functioning skills are important, but how do we prevent and recover? So all of these neurons, as you can see, remember the use it or lose it. Dendrites grow based upon what you use. So we want to do brain-based parenting. We want to do brain-based praise. Integrate that into your daily language. Take a look at the skills, memorize them. I've got lots of scripts in chapter 6 that help you know, okay, what do I say to my kid at different ages? I also made sure that I added the different things that you could do to prevent. And so I'll talk about a few of these as we go along, but you can get genetic testing to find out if you have predispositions for addiction. It's important to do consistent education. Keep your kids in pro-social activities. The more actively involved they are in sports and clubs and after school things, the less time they will have to engage and get curious about risky things, and the more pro-social mentors and people they will have in their lives. Family dinners, creating a family code, I'll talk about in a second, and make sure you give consistent consequences. Engage your family in proactive community action, teaching them empathy and gratitude and honoring their community. And then, of course, if they do engage, please go big. Give a big consequence soon or get help as soon as possible. So let's specifically dive into what are some of the tools that parents can use from the NeuroWhereAbouts guide. This is really a short list. I had to pick the things that were really my favorite. So I'll share a couple of them with you. Here is the list of risky behavior that I did a lit review on and put into the book. Now, I've got them in chapters, so elementary, middle, and high school, so you know which behaviors spike when. There are graphs that show you so that you know when should I have the conversation, what age, and then when you go, oh my God, now what should I say? The scripts are in there to help you figure out how to talk to them about that particular behavior and how to build executive functioning skills. One of the best things that you can do is teach your kids emotional literacy, how to identify the feelings that you have using feeling wheels. This is my feeling wall. One of my favorite tools is kimochis. You can find them at kimochis.com. Kimochi is a Japanese word that means feeling. And I've got a big bowl of these in my office that kids can use. They're really fun at home. I have a family that puts them on the dinner table and you pass around the roast beef and you pass around the kimochis and you talk about your feelings for the day. Use the functional family rule. In our family, we talk, trust, deal, and feel. So I know you don't want to talk about pornography right now, but I just need 10 minutes of your time because in this family, we talk about stuff like that. And then, of course, if you need to shape behavior, I have a really good presentation I do about behavior modification and shaping behavior. And my behavior contract with the sample is actually in the book to give you some information about how do I use rewards and consequences to get my kids to follow rules. And then build a family code. So in the book, I have a family code building activity, and a family code is just a really short, unifying statement that you create with your kids. I did this at a local church recently. We got together, I talked about the brain, and all the families made their own code. And in the Collier family, we treat others with kindness, compassion, and respect on and offline. We actually don't use drugs ever because we protect our brain development, and only alcohol when we're 21 or over. That's a family code. Once you put that together with your kids, then put it on the wall of your home. And then at family dinners, when you're passing around the roast beef and the kimochis, you can say, hey, did you guys hear about what happened at school today? There was a kid who got in trouble for vaping. Anybody know anybody who vapes? Well, we wouldn't do that because our family code, and you point to it on the wall, says that we don't use substances ever. Now, it's really important that you know family dinners are preventative and protective. There's a great website called the Family Dinner Project that's got lots of really cool question generators depending upon age. And there's research that shows the more family dinners that families have, the ones in green, 5 to 7 family dinners per week, know a lot more about their kids. And it helps them create unity, feel more a part of. When kids feel that way, they want to follow the rules more often. I put together a conversation starter calendar for you. So when you're sitting at the dinner table, you can go, okay, it is July, and look, it's a National Give Something Away Day. Let's talk about that. And then next month, hey, guess what? It's Drive Sober and Ride Sober Day. Have you guys heard, does anybody that you know drink and drive? Yeah, we don't do that in our family because that's our code. And then the next month, it's Weight Stigma Awareness. Do you guys know what that means? Have you ever heard of body image issues? And then it's a really great segue once a month to be able to talk about these behaviors and refer back to the family code. I have lots of other tools in the book. Alcohol poisoning card that you can cut out and put in your kiddo's wallet, you know, when they're old enough to drive and go out to parties on their own. Activity pyramid, which can help them learn how much activity and technology to balance. I've got a talk for every issue in the book. Here's the gambling talk and the pornography talk. I really love the pornography. These are my two favorite because I always put fun activities that you could do with your kids and silly questions. Now, you don't have to use all of them, but you know, it helps you bring up the topic. And then I thought this was interesting because when talking to porn, we really have to start young. But I wanted to make sure parents felt comfortable because I put developmentally appropriate language for all ages for these really difficult topics to talk about in the book. There is a media talk, a medicine talk, different tools like smartphone contracts, driving contracts, whereabouts log, so you can be on the same page with your kids' peers, parents, you know, for sleepovers and things like that when sometimes risky behavior happens. And then, of course, what you can do as a community. There are clinical tools in this book. When we talk about hypofrontality, teaching people, teaching your parents, teaching your administrators how to watch out for this and teach this to kids, as well as diagnosing what appropriate level of use somebody is in to determine their level of care, the things that you can do at each level to prevent and treat. And then if you do have somebody that falls in the category of abuse or dependence, you got to know what are the options for treatment out there. I put in the book the Youth Recovery Continuum, which shows you the different levels of support that are out there in the world to help with kids who are engaging in the behavior. We want to make sure that they stay connected at all levels of their development. And then, of course, stages of change. How do you talk to your kid or your clients, depending upon what stage they're in, if they're in resistance or denial? I've also got information and a lot of research about utilities of drug testing. And we can talk a little bit more about that if you have a question. Also, teaching kids the responsible drinking formula, which feels weird to teach kids this, but you know, when most kids go out and try it, they don't try it in a responsible way. So making sure that you let kids know, I expect you to wait until you are 21 or older to responsibly drink, but I need you to know what that looks like so that you know what it doesn't look like and can be responsible when you see it happening in other kiddos. All right, that does it for me today. I hope that you learned a whole lot of information. Sometimes it's like drinking from a fire hydrant, but please know the book is there for you in ebook. It is on Audible in English and in Spanish. I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over now to our Operation Parent crew.
Thanks, Dr. Coir. That was wonderful. So much information and packed in just a chunk of time. We appreciate you so much.
You got it. You got it.
We're going to pull our slides up here in just a second, but I just wanted to let folks know they can further look at your topics. And we, I meant to mention this in the beginning, but like we toggle each other on high risk topic interest. So our handbooks are focused in on what you mentioned as your favorite, the ones you had to pick as your favorite high risk activities, and why we're in this prevention business. So we pretty much mirror each other on what our favorite high risk activities are that we want parents to know about ahead of time, get ahead of, and prevent. So we're just going to let you know about, Nikki, do you mind to forward the slide just a little bit? We're going to let you know just quickly about, if you have a question right now, you can certainly put that in the queue, but I wanted to let you know we have several lined up already. And then we're going to tell you a couple things about Operation Parent while we give you a moment to get your questions in. One exciting thing is we have a brand new elementary handbook. This is a sneak peek of the cover. So for those of you that have been with us for a long time and have ordered handbooks in the past, this is definitely available to start viewing and learning more about. These, just as Dr. Coir's book is as well, excellent for parents, foster parents, grandparents, school staff, pediatricians, basically anyone can benefit from both of our materials and both of our books. It's something like, as you're starting your prevention plan for the fall, if you bought a bundle, if you bought Dr. Coir's book and an Operation Parent handbook, elementary and middle, I think you would be ready to hit the road running. So we've got elementary version featured here. We've also have a middle and high version of our handbook, which is running $12.99. Those are available for order right now. You can go to our website at operationparent.org/shop and order yourself an individual copy of the handbook. We also ask you to also think about family and friends who might benefit from the information. So if you already have a handbook, you might want to order a new elementary one, take a sneak peek at it for yourself, and then maybe even hand it over to a friend or family member that could use it. We have a bulk offer today. If you're a drug-free coalition or a school, church, a group who could use the handbooks in bulk, it's 15% off of any quantity, and the coupon code is 15SUMMER. The offer is a very short offer this time. It's going to end on August the 2nd. The other thing I wanted to say about Dr. Coir's book is, if you're a drug-free coalition that's on with us today, the youth branch of your coalition would really get into this material. That you have written this in such a way that it appeals to everyone. So I could see my teens picking that book up and getting into it. The infographics are just, they're beautiful, they're easy to read, easy to understand. But I just want to also say the youth in your communities would enjoy, I think, the infographics, the content, the way it's laid out, but also the Audible version of the book. So I really encourage you to dig in that way, and think about how you can ramp up prevention for the fall. Maybe even order a bundle, an Operation Parent Handbook as well as Dr. Coir's book. And then just reminding you to continue to join us on the webinar journey. Dr. Aaron Weiner will be with us August the 2nd, talking about emotional trauma. And then Dr. Terada, eating disorders on October the 4th at 1 o'clock. Okay, we've got a lot of questions, so here we go.
Great.
Lots of positive feedback and thank yous in the queue for your work and being
Wonderful.
with us today too. Okay, so when a person starts using at 18, do they have arrested development as well?
Most definitely, because remember, the frontal lobe does not completely develop until 25. And so even that they started using at around 18, it also depends upon what they're using and how much they're using. You know, if they're drinking responsibly and not binge drinking, their liver may help process the toxin out of their body before dopamine has the chance to spike too high. And so, but if they engage in binge drinking or multiple substance use, they can cause arrested development and shut off the next few years of development for their brain if they continue with that intensity and frequency.
So we had a viewer also mention that they're going to share the recording with their 16 and 8-year-old children or young adults, which that makes our hearts very happy. That's why we did this today, and it's a great presentation to share with your teens. And just reminding those of you that are live with us, you're going to get the recording link tomorrow, so that's an easy thing to do. Okay, so how does alcohol play a role in development compared to meth and cocaine?
So you know, alcohol is it's so pervasive, and in our culture, there's almost this rite of passage for drinking. And I've actually studied other cultures and their ideas about alcohol. And if you talk to families in France or Greece or Italy, they say we do not allow our kids to binge drink. There's a taboo against it. We teach them to honor and revere alcohol if it's a part of our, national gross product in some of those cases. And unfortunately, our country, the United States, consumes 90% of the global drug supply. We have a very gluttonous relationship with substances. And so, if you add alcohol and substances together over time, especially like marijuana, which arrests development longer, you're going to have a more profound arrested development effect. And so, hopefully, I think that answered the question. I'm not sure. I got lost.
Definitely.
Okay.
And I'm just can't get past that statistic. 90%.
Yes.
Of that's frightening. So
It's quite,
frightening.
yes.
Okay. Can you catch up in executive development after the age of 25?
Well, let's just say the brain's rule is forever, use it or lose it. And so you can. And so I have worked with plenty of adults who've gotten into recovery much later, who then work on executive functioning skills. And so it's interesting because if you go into recovery, if you get a good therapist, a good clinician, you'll start learning those skills. There's a saying in recovery, it's almost like growing up in public, because if you can imagine you're a 40-year-old person after 3 DUIs, you get into recovery and you realize, oh, I'm acting like a kid, like a 12-year-old. Well, I started when I was 12. That makes sense. But within, the first 5 to 10 years of recovery, you can work on those skills. And if you use good problem solving, better judgment, nice decision making, if you practice empathy, you actually grow more dendrites for those behaviors. The only caveat is that it takes a lot longer when you're an adult, right? Because remember, those first 25 years of life, plasticity, which means brain flexibility, how quickly it grows, is at its peak, and then it's slowly kind of downhill as we grow older. So the answer is yes, but it just takes a little bit more time than it would have had we learned them in the first place.
Yeah, and that's what you were saying too, that like when you think about learning a language, it's much easier to do that when you're young.
Yep.
Sure, you can do it when you're older, but it takes a lot longer, right? It takes.
Absolutely. Like we have about 90% of our brain cells that we're ever going to make by the time we're 6. And so if you start learning languages around that time, it's like you're just a sponge absorbing that information in your brain. But then your brain prunes a lot of cells. If you're using those cells regularly, you don't prune them, you keep them. But if you don't, you get out of practice, and the skills, literally, they don't get to make connections.
Yeah, great point. Great point. Do you happen to know any studies, or could you share them with us if you maybe find them after the webinar? I know you know them, but you might not know the name of the study off the top of your head. The relationship between dopamine and nicotine tobacco use.
Oh my God. And all you have to do is look in the book. In almost, let's see, in the middle school and the high school chapters, you will find information about nicotine and vaping. And here's a couple interesting statistics. Out of 100 people who drink alcohol, 16 will become an alcoholic. Out of 100 people who use marijuana, about 17 will become a cannabis addict because of the high potency weed. It used to be about 8, 9. Out of 100 people who try nicotine, 62 of them will get addicted. It is the #1 most addictive substance on the face of the earth. And I actually have that chart in the book so you can show it and teach it to kids. It's just so addictive, but it doesn't cause intoxication like other drugs do. So there are actually 2 substances that are highly addictive that don't. Nicotine is one and caffeine is the other. Very addictive, but it doesn't cause intoxication. However, it's all of the junk and toxins and chemicals that come along in tobacco or vaping liquid that are incredibly deadly. Nicotine in and of itself arrests brain development. And then, of course, all the other things that come with it cause a lot of other havoc to the brain and body.
Oh man, such good information. Scary to know, but good to know.
Yes.
Do dopamine receptor sites ever return to normal?
Well, so when you say return to normal,
Let me give you the second part of the question too, because that might frame it. I want to honor the question was, do former addicts ever feel pleasure again?
Oh my God, yes. Thank goodness. And I'm a good example of that. I remember when I first got into recovery, I was kind of on this pink cloud. I was so happy that I was getting clean and sober. I was feeling better, big pink cloud. But then I went back into life, life on life's terms, having to figure out how to clean up all the messes that I had made, and the pink cloud kind of disappeared. But remember, it takes about 18 months for the brain to heal, the frontal lobe to turn back on. And what we also know is that those extra receptor sites that you create become inactive. It's not that they return to normal. You've actually created too many of them. You've grown too many of them. And so, but they can become inactive. And then what happens is the normal levels of dopamine in your body will actually bind to the receptors that are active. And you start to return to baseline levels of calmness and happiness. But you also have to remember, if you have the genetic predisposition, you actually make a little bit less dopamine than everybody else. And so it's really important to figure out how to replace dopamine in your life. And so what I mean by that is, recovering meetings, 12-step meetings are a great place, a source of dopamine naturally, because, you see people, you talk to people, you communicate, you have a common bond, and that increases dopamine levels. You get a sponsor and you start sponsoring people and helping others, increases dopamine levels. exercise. I do hot yoga, really great source of serotonin and dopamine, and I go with a girlfriend. And so I've got, you know, my dopamine source there. So if you think about, like, you have to replace the drug and give yourself other sources of healthy dopamine. I always think about what the world would be like if we did not have alcohol and drugs. Like, we would have a lot more long strings of neurons for natural skills. We would develop really great neuronal connections for all of these natural coping mechanisms. We would not want to escape negative feelings as much. We would actually learn how to cope with negative feelings in a better way. As you know, right, you can escape with alcohol and drugs or binging on pornography or Netflix or shoe shopping. No, shoe shopping's okay. Just let's make that clear. Shoe shopping's okay. But all the other things that you can do to escape how you feel just create longer strings of neurons for escaping how you feel. If you really just learn how to handle life on life's terms and get the help that you need from doctors and therapists and friends and family, and start cultivating healthy families of choice, if you come from an unhealthy family of origin, then you can actually repair a lot of the damage that maybe took place. Great question.
Great advice on how to heal. Keep healing and increasing the dopamine for anyone who might be struggling out there. That's great advice. And related to that, a viewer asked, what are child-friendly ways to increase dopamine if you know that your child is struggling early on?
Oh, very much. So, you know, if your kid is struggling with any kind of mood or mental health issue, find a clinician that specializes in that issue in that age group. And it may take you a while to find someone, ask your friends, get referrals, learn more about what's going on with that kiddo. You may want to try to get some genetic testing. There are a lot of natural supplements that you can take that are not psychotropic in nature. I take methylfolate because there's some research that says it helps your brain increase natural levels of dopamine. There's a lot of other things out there that you can take. And then, of course, if you have to take medications for particular issues, making sure that you always stick with a really good clinician who treats the issues but also does therapy too. It's kind of a pet peeve of mine when I see clinicians or pediatricians just stick kids on stimulants, because stimulants can change your brain structure. But if you've got a kid who really has truly debilitating ADHD or ADD, they're going to have academic and social problems if they are unmedicated. And so if they take medication and it improves their academic and social functioning, that is the balance, right? But then you want to make sure that you do prevention early. You create a family code and you let them know, because of the medication you're on, you're a little bit more at risk for engaging in high risk behavior or getting addicted to things. And so here's the rule, kiddo, and here are the consequences. And we're going to make sure that you get involved in lots of healthy dopamine activities. Sports, clubs, friendships, making sure that kids go on slumber party events and scouting things and overnight stuff is important, but you got to be on the same page with their adults. As so many adults today use marijuana or have alcohol readily accessible in their homes, not to mention all the other, you know, possible digital dangers from technology or unlocked gun cabinets and stuff like that. So that's why I put the whereabouts log there, so that you could have a list of questions that you ask the other parent, and make sure that you find things that your kids want to engage in. And then the last thing I'll say on that is, a lot of times parents, like, kids will try stuff and then they won't want to finish it. I always, you know, encourage parents to require their child, okay, like, you signed up for karate for this semester, so you're finishing, kiddo. But once you're done, you can switch to something else, but you have to switch to something else. You can't just do nothing. As kids grow, they may get, you know, tired of this or that. But as soon as, I can't tell you how many kids I've worked with, like, oh, I stopped playing soccer and then I started smoking weed after school, or, oh, I stopped, you know, the debate club and I was going to do this, but I never did. And then, you know, they talked to me about getting addicted to technology because they had too much free time. We have to teach our kids how to utilize the free time to rest, relax, and make sure that they are filling their brain and their time with really healthy dopamine spiking activities, depending upon, you know, their age.
Age appropriate, and yep, keep them around healthy, good
Definitely.
friends, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Oh, that sounds so good. So, right now I'd like to enter the giveaway. So
Oh,
3 very fortunate viewers are gonna be able to get your book. So what you need to do to be eligible for that is put your first name, last name, and your mailing address in the question section. I promise we're just going to pick the first 3 entries. So, you know, just give it a couple seconds and then you know we'll have our 3 winners. But while folks are entering their name, why don't we close with what's your most favorite part of the book?
oh gosh, that's such a hard question. I mean, so I love the infographic nature of it. And so like there's actually, I have a favorite page, I guess. There's a really cool graph in the middle school chapter. I'll show it to you. It's right here because I graph all the behaviors, right? So you can see bullying peaks in the 7th grade. And then you can see that cyberbullying peaks in the 8th grade. But if you notice this huge statistically significant drop from 8th grade into high school, right? Then you can see how bullying, that really illustrates the 2 phases of brain development. Like here's the first phase right here from birth to up to 12, 11, and then, you know, 13 and above.
Oh, I
And
see. Yes.
you can see how empathy comes online, and then everybody goes, "Oh my God, I can't believe I treated you that way in middle school." Right? I've had so many adults in therapy say, "You won't believe who contacted my middle school bully contacted me on Facebook to apologize." But I don't, you know, I think that the most powerful thing about what I learned and why I wrote this book is because parents have to know the use it or lose it rule. And
Yes.
if you know, you got to get your kid to use those skills, right? So I put, you know, in the first chapter, we talk a lot about brain development and this idea that in that first phase of brain development, you are a director, you run the show. But as soon as your kid moves into the second phase of brain development, you got to move into the trainer role. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. Like once your kids start going out into the world without you, they need to be trained, right? Like how to handle situations. And so instead of saying, hey, do this, what you want to say is, how would you do this? Right? You change everything into a question and then brain-based praise, rewarding them for using good executive functioning skills. So I really love the infographic nature of the book, and that, you know, it's separated into developmental stages, that it's developmentally appropriate language for each stage. I had a really good friend of mine who's also a therapist. She called me and said, "Oh my God, I just found my 11-year-old reading your book." And I snuck out of the room so she wouldn't hear me. And I said, "Oh, could you get a review from her?" And her daughter said, "I like this Dr. Collier. Like, she tells the truth." And I was like,
Mm-hmm.
"Oh, that's awesome." So it's inspired me to write a NeuroWhereAbouts guide actually for kids instead of directed toward parents, so that you kind of have a guidebook, you know, of what to do. But you know, really empowering parents to do brain-based parenting and protect that frontal lobe, train it. So by the time that they are ready to be fully self-supporting, they really are fully self-supporting.
Oh man, that's music to my ears. It's so good. We want to let the viewers know, like the 3 lucky winners from the book are going to get the book right away. So you're going to have a great start to your fall.
Okay.
We also wanted to share too. We've got a neat, more emphasis on gaming in that new elementary handbook that we talked about, and so we're interested to get that out with parents. If you are an organization who wants to know more about that new elementary handbook and game, just the whole concept that we've got to get with our children earlier for prevention. So gaming is just one of the topics in that new elementary handbook, which Nikki, who's on with us today, worked really hard to get the new elementary handbook up and out. But she did a neat focus on gaming. Her family are gamers for light fun. And so she has a deep knowledge of gaming. So there's a neat emphasis on gaming and lots of other topics that we need to get in front of elementary age kiddos. So I was just going to say, for anybody who wants to get a little bit more information about that, Allie and Carol, my teammates, are such prevention focused trailblazers, and they can share with you how our handbook is being used across the country with schools and DFCs, how they're distributing that handbook out in the community as well, to just get um, parents familiar with all the different things that you need to be thinking about staying in front of what your children might encounter at some point. And like you said, sort of have that the family code or the family response like pre-practiced, because we don't know as we send our kids out what they're going to face. But if we've got some pretty good uh, foundation and armor on them of what some responses could be, you know, that's a good feeling.
Most definitely, yes.
Most
I want to make sure
definitely.
everybody knows too that I'd love to be able to come to your school or your parent group. I can talk about what I talked about today, but I also have a presentation on all the 18 different high-risk behaviors in the book, including video game addiction and technology overuse, which are so prevalent today. I've worked with a lot of adults who have video addiction, and it's become debilitating for them. But I would really love to come to y'all's your neck of the woods and talk for your community.
Sounds fantastic. Well, we hope that you'll join us again for another webinar down the line as well. And we're so grateful for your time today and for everyone else who joined us. This has been a great afternoon, and we'll look forward to seeing everyone again on August the 2nd.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Michelle.
Dr.
Appreciate it.
Coir. Have
You
a good
got it.
rest of the week.
All right. Bye, guys.
See ya.